Good afternoon, good morning. We're just waiting for a few more people to arrive and then we'll get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being part of the episode 5 of the People and Culture series. This episode is about emotional intelligence and how it's the sustainable fuel for engagement. My name is Mark Hamill and I'm the CEO of Architect Global, a company that specializes in helping an organization improve. And we work on a number of things as customer experience through to communications and what we're talking about today, which is emotional intelligence and talent management. Just a bit of housekeeping. Please keep yourself on mute until it opens up for the Q&A. And any questions that you have, please type them in the chat and we'll make sure we get back to them at the very end. And enjoy it. I hope you have fun and learn a lot today. I'm just going to introduce you to our speakers. So I'll hand it over to Diane and Sandra to do a brief introduction, and then we'll share some slides as well. So Diane, over to you if you want to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. Welcome this morning. I am going to play a little bit of MC. I have been with Sandra, she's the brain of this work, but I have been in this space a long time, and I am so pleased to see this topic come up on so many more board and executive level conversations. I think it's something that we have seen grow over the last 2 years, and so building this muscle is really important, and we hope today some of the key takeaways and things we want you to go do as a result of this, as well as not only for your organization but for you personally. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Ms. Thompson.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm an emotional intelligence coach, which basically means I spent about 2 years learning how to do rather than just to study what this stuff is. So I'm really looking forward to this session because I fundamentally believe that an understanding of emotion and the grasp of emotional intelligence will help us to create better, much better customer experiences and also employee experiences. So we've got a whole range of things to show you, a few ideas for you to consider. We're really looking forward to some of your questions. We've got a couple of cheeky little quizzes in here too. But this is really just an opportunity to share some of the things that both Diane and I know, just to provoke some conversation, I think, just perhaps a different lens on what customer experience might be.
Excellent.
Shall I kick off? Are we ready?
Rock.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, let's do this. So let me start off with the first thing of sharing my screen. See how that goes. Looking okie dokie. Okay. So I want to just invite you to just look at these eggs for a second. Different facial expressions, different emotions, different things going on. Well, I'm kind of feeling like the egg that is second in from the right. I know what's in store for you guys, but ultimately this is absolutely about emotional intelligence being the sustainable fuel for engagement. What on earth are we talking about? Well, emotional intelligence isn't quite what you think it is. And certainly, as Diane has mentioned, there's an opportunity for us to use this skill far more within organizations. And actually, lots of people regard it as a soft skill. Lots of people think it's quite fluffy. It's an option. It's the kind of thing that people do when they get in touch with their softer side. It's not true, I'm afraid. We've got a little quiz here to start off with where we've left some blanks in here. We want to propose that, in fact, it might mean soft skills, but it also means hard cash. So we've left a few blanks here because ultimately what emotional intelligence does is it enables you to create an emotional connection, not only with your colleagues, but also with your clients. And when you create that emotional connection, you're doing more than creating loyalty. It's absolutely about retention. And that is really what businesses need. We want to be in an environment where we trust the brands that we work with. We want to work with brands who will kind of look out for us and make sure that they proactively offer us things that make our life easier. So I'm actually going to show you in a second what these numbers are, but I'd like to invite you to put some numbers into the chat. Forget about the top paragraph for a second, but just look at the bottom one for a minute. This relates to the legal sector, and I'd like you to guess what percentage increase they have added to their hourly rate because they practice emotional intelligence. I'd like you to think about how much more profit per partner might be making, and perhaps how much more client retention they're getting. So just 3 numbers in the chat, if I could invite you to do so. Just take a moment to guess what those numbers might be. So what might be the percentage increase on the hourly rate, what might be the higher profits, and what might be the higher client retention? Knock yourself out, put a few numbers in there. Just wait for that chat number to go up, just looking for 3 magic numbers, and then I shall go and reveal the answer. Oh, looking good, looking good. So 3 magic numbers. I'm gonna go straight over. We know that a 5% increase in client retention is estimated on occasion to produce up to 85% increase in profits over a lifetime of a client because of repeat business. People by people, I'm not over keen on that phrase, but the fact is, when we connect with people, this is the kind of result we can expect. They have less sensitivity to pricing, we know that. There's more opportunity for cross-selling. And here are the answers for the actual legal case study. An 8% increase on hourly rates, 33% higher profits per partner, and 39% higher client retention. So I ask you, is this really about soft skills? Or are we talking about hard cash? It makes sense, right? I want to introduce you to a few people. I've met a couple. I haven't met all of them. I certainly know the chimp. I'll tell you about that in just a second. But we've got Daniel Goleman here, going to talk to you about his work. Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a neuroscientist. We've got Dan Cable, who's also a neuroscientist and psychologist. And you may recognize Dan, and his name's gone out of my head. Dan, help me here, Diane. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me. He's an amazing guy. It'll come back to me in a minute. Pink. Thank you, Dan Pink. Of course, I'm wearing the colour. But the idea now, I'm just going to go into a few ideas with you just to kind of whet your appetite, and then we're going to go into a quiz. So let's start off with the man himself, who made emotional intelligence kind of famous around 26 years ago. Now, he's not the inventor of emotional intelligence. That actually happened a few years before, but the scientists who came up with this idea didn't articulate it in the way that Goleman did. He was a journalist at the New York Times, and he basically created a book that was a bit provocative because he was basically giving people the idea that you didn't have to have a high IQ to be successful, which basically meant, do you know what? I'm not born with this limiting belief. I can be whatever I want to be. He was talking about how EQ could matter more than IQ. And this was basically his definition. He was talking about emotional intelligence being the ability to recognize and understand emotions in ourselves and others. And then it's the ability to manage your behavior and your relationships. Sounds really straightforward, but ultimately today, with everything that's going on, with us rushing around and making snap decisions, with us reacting in the moment rather than perhaps considering response, this is critical. And we're going to talk in a minute about the actual model that Goleman came up with, and to talk about the 12 competencies within it. But in the meantime, I'd like to invite you to take part in a little bit of a fun quiz. So please be ready to answer a few of these questions. I think there's only 5, but let's see how we get on. What kind of listener are you? Do you pay full attention to what the other person is saying and you notice body language? Do you listen closely when you're not distracted by your phone? Do you get the general gist of what's going on and then you often finish someone's sentence? Or, sorry, what was the question? Just put a letter into the chat and let us know which one you think you are. What type of listener are you? That's the first one we're going for. Let's see those numbers go up. Brilliant. Next area is focus. Now, how focused are you on the person you are empathizing with? Do you ask them questions to help the person describe their experience and feelings? Or do you like to give the person some suggestions on how they might solve their problem? The third option could be, I've always got a story about a similar situation I know they like to hear. And then the final option, D, is funny thing is, I always end up talking about me. You can see a theme coming on here. Which one would you go for? Please post your answers in the chat. Understanding. Now, this again goes into the kind of abilities we have to really be present for others. So here are the questions. What lengths do you go to know how the other person is feeling? I never know exactly how the other person is feeling. That's not important. It's being there for someone, being supportive. Option B, it's easy for me to work out exactly what the other person is feeling and why. C, I just know precisely how someone feels as I know I am feeling the same. And the final one, there's only 6 emotions out there. I pick one of the 6 to describe how the other one's feeling. It's really simple. Again, go for which one you think you might be. Let's see now, learning. This is our final question. So what do you do to build your empathy muscle? A, I'm always trying to become more self-aware. It's an ongoing process. The greater my self-awareness, the better I am at empathizing. Second option, I think I'm empathetic, but I often ask people if that is the case. Empathy and sympathy are the same thing, aren't they? I'm great at sympathy. And then finally, you're either empathetic or you're not. I'm not going to bother trying. Which one are you going for? You can see that. The numbers going up on the chat. Lovely, lovely. Thank you. Well, it's probably no surprise that those people that gave A as most of their answers will be those that are practicing and understand emotional intelligence. Holding the space for somebody, listening to what they're saying and asking great questions is really a skill we often take for granted. The fact is, and we'll talk more about this in a second, how someone feels is unique to them, and how you feel in that moment is unique to you. So being able to be present for them and to really listen is certainly one of the competencies within emotional intelligence. If you scored mostly B, you can dip in and out. You're still learning. You're definitely in the space where you have the awareness and the ability to focus in, but perhaps you're not doing it as often. You don't have the opportunity to do it as often as you like. If you scored mostly C, there is a bit of work to do, I'm afraid, but it's not too late. We have this wonderful thing called neuroplasticity, which means that the brain can actually make new neural pathways and you can learn, most certainly. If you scored mostly D, you're really going to need to pay attention to this presentation, because it looks like emotional intelligence is something that you might want to consider, because ultimately, if you're not listening and you're not focusing, you're not understanding, and you're not necessarily learning, there's an opportunity still for you, but you might have a bit further to go. So the point of mentioning this to you in just a bit of a fun quiz is that it is something that people can develop, and at any age. People often ask me, do you know, I've got an auntie that's in her 80s, she's thinking about doing a course. Brilliant. You're never too old. It's never too late. And believe me when I say that it is a lifelong dedication, because I still do flip my beans and I still do lose my temper, but I still am learning from it. Any questions from that at all? Diane, would you like to chip in with any observations there?
No, I think what's interesting when we think about all of these techniques are really things that we do. And I think we should recognize for ourselves, we know when we do them well. And that recognition and that celebration of being aware and cognizant of what you're doing and the interactions you're having is part of that mind shift. So it's also this self-reflection, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to really understand how your emotions can help you understand more about theirs. So that's building the muscle.
Yeah.
So let's get into these three people and the chimp. I think people are probably really curious about the chimp, and I love the analogy. So let's start with Mr. Pink.
Mr. Pink, whose name I forgot. Can you believe that? So when we think about engagement, I wonder if you come across this guy and you remember his name and you've read this book, Drive. For me, when I read this book, it was like I suddenly understood why I stayed in some organizations and I left others. He believes that there are three keys to engagement and emotional connection in the workplace. Mastery is one, autonomy is the second, and purpose is the third. The mastery element is giving people the opportunity to be really good at what they do, giving them the skills, the opportunity, to equip them with the space that they need to be great. And when we think about that, when we think about the number of environments in the customer experience space, you can tell those that get frustrated that they don't know enough. They don't feel that they have complete control of a situation to be able to solve problems, to actually know the missing piece of information or to solve things. So mastery is critical. Autonomy is also really important. And I think that this work from home experiment that's been happening in the last couple of years has brought that to life, with many managers not really knowing how to give enough space and to also be calm about not having complete control. The fact is, we don't like being told what to do. And the fact is, we do like to have control, ultimate influence over what we're doing. And what Dan Pink says is that when we perceive that we are adding value and our voice is heard, we are far more likely to be connected. Purpose, I reckon most of you will recognize straight away. But again, having that reason for being, the meaningful work, the purpose of what you're doing. This isn't about the task that you're actually undertaking. This is the story of the customers whose lives are different as a consequence of your contribution to something. So that's Dan Pink, and that's his perspective. If you ever get to see this guy live, I should highly recommend it. Not only is he hilarious, he's also very thought-provoking. He wrote a book, Dan Cable, called Alive at Work. And I'm going to whiz through these because this is really the summary of the book. What he talks about, so we can see some parity here with Pink, freedom within a frame. People don't like to be completely left to their own devices. They like to have some degree of structure, but they like freedom within it, because ultimately we are creative creatures. We're not very good at repetition and boredom. We like to be able to influence what we're doing within a structure that we know is safe. Onboarding with best selves. And this is very much about the personalization, the recognition of who you are. So rather than trying to get you into the corporate uniform straight away, it's enabling you to be expressive and to set the terms with agreement with your boss as to how you want to show up. Hugely amazing. And certainly from a psychological contract perspective, which we'll talk about in a minute, this is the opportunity to set the experience for your employees in the right pace, in the right way from the very start. Self is a story we tell ourselves. We can change our story. This is very much about reframing. Who are you? What do you want to be? How do you want to show up? And what he talks about is that the work environment should support you when you want to metamorphosize into something slightly different. I don't know how I feel about this one, but I'll leave you guys to think about this. Self-reflective job titles. So he suggests that actually you can name yourself whatever you really think your contribution is. I think it takes quite a open-minded, outward-looking organization to do that. I think there's something very interesting about control and ownership. I don't know that every organization I've worked with would agree to it, but he talks about it being engaging. And then finally, use the seeking system to frame the task, not performance. This is about curiosity. This is about setting an outcome and letting your staff work out how to get to that best result. This isn't about being very, very prescriptive about everything that goes on. Dan Cable, check him out. Lisa Feldman Barrett, a neuroscientist who is quite controversial, quite honestly. She's saying some stuff that many scientists aren't liking very much. But the bonus part here is that she has MRI scans, she has thousands of reports that her and her team have pored over. So this is really cutting edge science. What she is saying is that emotions are not what you think they are. They are unique to every individual, and they are shaped by the experiences we've had and the meaning we have attached to those experiences. They're to do with the context. I'm going to tell you a really quick story about that. She talks in one of her, I think it's a TED talk actually, she talks about seeing this much of someone's face and it looks like the person is in absolute agony, tears, frowning, distress. And then when the actual picture zooms out, you see that it's one of the Williamses holding up the Wimbledon trophy in utter triumph and delight. So she's talking about context. Don't get a misunderstanding in your mind because you don't understand the context of the emotion being shown. And finally, socialization. Our values, our beliefs that have been shaped by the people who actually influenced our early years, our parents, our aunties, uncles, our teachers, significant figures who told us what was right and what was wrong. And it's the combination of these three things that shape how we feel about stuff. And so I'd like to ask you to consider, if every single one of us have had different experiences, different contexts, different socialization, how can we honestly get into each other's shoes? More about that in just a second. The chimp, loving that picture. This is taken from an amazing book, which some of you may actually have read. It's called The Chimp Paradox. Dr. Steve Peters has influenced the performance of Olympians. This stuff is quite incredible. And the bottom line here is that the really old part of our brain, the amygdala, which are basically a couple of almond-shaped neurons, they are the emotional center of our brain. The stick person represents the prefrontal cortex, which is like our executive center. And that's where we make decisions, we think logically, and everything is fine in the world. The problem here is that the chimp is far more powerful than the stick person. And so if something happens to us, which we're not expecting, and the chimp goes, sorry, what's that? Decides to go berserk, prevents any messaging going to the stick person, and that's when you see red, or you don't remember when you lost your temper, when you said some things perhaps you shouldn't have said. And the reason why I'm mentioning this, the chimp paradox, and the chimp himself or herself, is that this is when emotional intelligence comes into its own. Because if I said to you that the neuroscience says you are not at the mercy of your emotions, you don't have to be at the mercy of your emotions. You can actually influence how you show up every day. That is why emotional intelligence is so powerful, because when you learn that skill, you can calm that chimp right down, which means that the prefrontal cortex, happy days, it can think far more clearly. Of course, the chimp still has a job in preventing us from being run over by a bus or jumping off a cliff by accident or whatever it might be. There is still some survival techniques that are really important, but it doesn't need to go berserk when an email comes in that might just wind us up. And it really doesn't have to go berserk if someone says something or gives a facial expression we just don't know what that is. So that's really it for this particular section. We've introduced you to Dan, who was talking about what employee engagement is about. Same with Dan Cable. And getting into some of the brain science here to say, if you are able to influence how your brain is, then you are more likely to be engaged because you're less likely to be triggered. So before we go into the model of emotional intelligence, anything to add in there, Diane? Anything you've experienced, anything you'd like to share?
No, I think what comes to mind for me with the chimp is just a recent event that was on TV at an award ceremony, where this this emotional intelligence of those emotions sometimes take over what we would see as reason. And so I think just being aware of that and understanding how we as human beings respond to that not only mentally, emotionally, but physically as well, that it really drives a lot of behavior. So sometimes I think it's also important when you think about emotional intelligence to also pay attention to the nonverbals. This is something else we'll talk about as we get into kind of the self-awareness and self-management and thinking through how your emotional intelligence fits in with the rest of the world. Let's go on to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Because I think it's super important when we think about emotional intelligence and the domains and competencies. If you'll go to the next slide.
Here we are.
That we think a little bit about how it plays out in these various forms. And this is out of an article from HBR. It's a little dated, but what we like about it is it's a structure to really think about know thyself, right? Know thyself first, that understanding those signals and what you're feeling, even though you might not have thought process around it yet, becomes that basis for how we understand ourself, which then begins to let us balance, be more adaptable, really getting some changing that outlook, so to speak, right? How do you show up every day is based on how we know ourselves and our emotions and how we're able to change and shift related to where we want to be. And then once we have that, we begin the social awareness piece of being able to stand in each other's shoes by thinking about, even in the organization, where am I performing well and how am I perceived and how can I partner better or collaborate better. This is really important when we think about us as particularly experienced professionals, because we have to really build these teams. Our role is to break down those silos and get ourselves to think about the customer's emotions and how that's driving their behavior. So if we're not able to do that ourselves, how are we going to teach an organization to do that? And then that comes across in the relationship management, both for ourselves, our organizations, and customers. For example, how are we able to influence? How do we build that teamwork and inspirational leadership? So the fundamental part of this that we want to share is your awareness and this muscle that you're building around emotional intelligence is the basis for how you're able to do this work within your organization. So I bet if you were to ask yourself, the great CX practitioners, I bet you're going to say things like they're an influencer. They're able to really regulate what other people are thinking. It's always about me, not about them. It's those characteristics that are part of their emotional intelligence. And we find that they are, if you think about CX professionals, we're kind of wired that way. And so I think this, again, is a very important part of what we want to share, but it's not without its complexity. So if we go to the next slide. So I wanted to just think a little bit about, we all have this analogy of this iceberg, and really thinking about what we're doing and how things that are coming on the surface really show, but we all know there is a wide depth of really what drives that behavior. Our backgrounds, the conflicts we've had, how we've been raised, the companies we've worked in, the friends we've had, the relationships we've had, all come to bear when we think about coming to the surface and being part of that, what visibly people see from us. So that emotional intelligence is also about understanding the difference between these two. Like, I think there's a couple of days last week where I was feeling really rotten about something that had happened, unfortunately, and part of that was, still needing to go about my work, but being able to do that and handle those emotions at the same time. There's going to be those times when you need to rely on that very deep part of working internally, but also being aware of what's happening externally. Sandra, I'll pass it over to you to build on that a little bit.
Thank you. And I think that's the point about sustainable change, proper sustainable change. Because ultimately you can have all sorts of fancy programs and projects and transformation this and transformation that, but when we look beneath the waterline, there's such a mass of iceberg. And the fact is that how people feel drives their behavior. We'll come on to that in just a second, but I really would like to invite you to think about emotion as the driver of behavior. So how people feel, how they manage how they feel, how they respond to the behaviors of others. How are you plugged into that? And how can you influence that? Now, an incredible book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that took me a long time because I had to read it very slowly because it's a bit tricky, is by this guy, Daniel Kahneman. And he basically makes a number of points, but the key thing I want you to take away is that emotions drive behavior, behavior stimulates emotions, and then again, emotions drive behavior. This is going on as vortexes throughout the organization. What we also know is that emotions are contagious. We pick up on another person's vibe, whether we know what that emotion is. You know when you walk into a room, or you know when you get on a Zoom call, if someone is cross, or if someone is upset, or if someone is sulking, or if someone is ecstatically happy. You can pick it up from how they are, from their behavior. And I think here lies the opportunity to create meaningful experiences for one another, to acknowledge the emotions that you're having, to name them so that you can deal with it, and also to be in service, coming back to that quiz, asking great questions so that you can uncover how the other person is feeling about this change program that you're about to do, or about this thing you've asked them to do for a customer, or how you might like some particular departments to work slightly differently. We are driven by emotions, and 96% of the decisions we make are emotional, I'm afraid to say. So while we might believe that we're rational creatures, sorry, we're not.
I think it's important here to also extrapolate that out to a way that I've begun to help people understand what customer experience professionals do for a living. So when anybody used to ask me, I tried to explain what it was we do. Well, now I've changed that a little bit, and I have them tell me a story. I have them tell me a story about a great experience or a bad experience they've had. Invariably, they tell me what happened, then they tell me how they felt about it, then they tell me what they've done as a result of that experience and the emotions that they felt. And that's what has an impact on the brand. So if we think about also applying this to ourselves as customers, if we go somewhere and have a bad experience and it's tied to, that was really frustrating, that made me angry, whatever that emotion is, that's how we make decisions. And so this listening and having conversation and emotional intelligence about the information that's coming back from customers is really what's driving those business results. So I think that's a little bit of an aha moment to talk about not only your own emotional intelligence, but you are managing how customers feel about your brand, which drives behavior, which impacts your business results. They don't come anymore, they refer you to others. Whatever those behaviors are we're looking for, it's all based on this. Back to you.
I'm actually just going to share a quick story. So one of my first jobs when I was a student was working in a department store. And I'm not saying that I had emotional intelligence when I was that age, but certainly I could notice certain things in body language and facial expressions. And when I asked a customer a particular question, I felt like they're not answering the question, or they're giving me a whole bunch of stuff that is totally not related. I would go with a different type of question and I'd try and figure out, why are they avoiding this? And so the point here is it's not just about what people say, it's about what they don't say. It's about whether what they're saying matches with how they're actually posturing, and it's also in the voice. So all of these things that Diane is talking about, when you speak to customers, when you speak to colleagues, when you're tuned in, you can actually uncover a bunch of stuff that can prevent conflict, that can build bridges, that can actually be far more meaningful because you're in a completely different way, you're operating in a completely different way. So I wanted to just mention this as well, because it's not just about the cash, it's actually about well-being. The fact is that when people practice emotional intelligence, they do have better physical health because they're not feeling the pent-up stress and anxiety that they might have done without practicing this skill. This is particularly big in legal and in accounting and finance type roles. They also have better mental health because when they can recognize how they're feeling, they suddenly get this ability to do something. They don't suppress it, they air it in the way that they'd like to, they're more constructive, they don't regret losing their temper and having to repair a relationship. things move with more balance. And often it just comes down to this. Now, I asked my students in their first year to sit for 2 minutes and just breathe, to focus on their breathing. And they talk about how it changed everything. Because when you just take just 2 minutes out to focus just on your breath, what you're doing is you're telling the chimp, do you know what? She's got this. She's not stressing out. Her breath isn't short. She's not actually out of control. She's breathing calmly, and that has the ability to unlock far more focus and presence. So if you feel that you're getting irate and absolutely wound up, just take 2 minutes to breathe. So that's all the theory stuff. And we now want to kind of get into some practical bits and pieces so that you can find whatever you'd like to explore this skill on your own terms. I'm a big fan of this ex-professional cricketer in New Zealand who developed this fantastic product. It's the Emotional Culture Deck. It's really simple, actually. It's a deck of cards that has listed on it emotions. The white cards are less positive emotions. The black cards are more positive emotions. And do you know that this guy has worked with airlines, governments, police, the army to get them to understand far more than what is going on at the top of the iceberg. It has changed conversations by playing a game where people are able to articulate how they're feeling. That's just, I'm not getting any bonuses for promoting this, by the way. I'm just a really big fan. Check them out, because when you go to their website, which we can forward on actually, there's a whole bunch of digital assets that are available to you for free, because I really think that this definitely changed conversations in our household, and with a number of clients, it's just worth a go. Here are some other more tactical things that you might like to try. Just try them. What's the worst that can happen? Write down 3 things at the end of the day before you go to bed that went well for you. The idea is that you are focusing on the positive, you are leaving the day in a positive frame of mind. And what's really important is that you can recall those things. Very often, I know I certainly can focus in on the one thing that went really badly, when in fact, so many things went really well. It's just a nice prompt. And again, consider tiny acts of kindness throughout the day, because it will make you think. It doesn't take a gargantuan effort. It's just those little things. 20 years ago, I kid you not, I was in a job, very stressful, one particular day. I'd sorted out my dry cleaning. It was running out of time and I had a deadline. And someone came back to my desk with my dry cleaning. They picked up the ticket without me seeing. They brought me my dry cleaning and a cup of tea. That has stayed in my mind all of those years. That's a tiny act of kindness, but it made a massive difference. And then finally, just as a suggestion, when you start the day, write down 3 things that you're grateful for, because here's the thing, when you focus on gratitude, the anxiety is reduced. It is overpowering when you're in the gratitude state. Other things are kind of knocked out. Diane, anything to add to this before I go on to my next slide?
Not at all. I like the practical things to go do.
Okay, so these ones are a little bit, daring. See how you get on with these. Taking a mindful walk. And this is all about adaptability. It might seem a bit random, but the fact is, when you go for a walk and you're noticing the sounds around you, whether that's the birds singing or juggernauts going past or whatever it is, you're taking yourself out of the things, the tactical, practical work things or home things, and you're focusing in on something else. When your mind wanders back to that task, take it back to the sounds. And again, this practice, this mindful walk is inviting your brain to do different things. You are in control, more control than you realize. And this is a great practice for adaptability. Now, this last one, silence for 5 minutes a day if you can, because here's the thing. Silence actually restores the nervous system and the conditions of the mind to make it more adaptive. It's also associated with the development of new cells in the hippocampus. There is a reference down there to a Harvard Business Review article that explains this far better, but the great thing is you will feel like you've either had a new life or you've had a sleep for several hours. It really is that refreshing. And to really consider your nervous system when you are under stress, if you can get silence, either some ear defenders or whatever you might need to get in order to create that, it is highly recommended. So that's a practical thing, a couple of practical things. The other thing you might like to explore is some work by a lady called Carol Dweck. She writes about the growth mindset. And in many respects, this is a reflective exercise for you to consider how much of your behavior might be coming from a place that isn't necessary. And what I mean by that is you can choose to have a fixed mindset and you can choose to have a growth mindset. So that's really just an invitation for you to kind of get to that point. The other aspect of that is, of course, being more curious, more spontaneous if you're able to. And I'll also send you a Harvard Business Review article about curiosity and the invitation to ask other questions. Not sure if you read this book by a gentleman called Viktor Frankl. He survived Auschwitz, and some of the writings in his book are huge. They're a game changer. But the thing that we often talk about as Goldman emotional intelligent coaches is this statement, because as a species, we have a choice. Between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space, we have power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And what he's basically saying is, you choose to react, or you could choose to respond. And while this might not seem like a practical exercise, it really is. And it tests me every day. When something happens and I feel the sensation of feeling cross or feeling angry or whatever it might be, just pause. You know the saying, sleep on it, feel totally different in the morning. You can do that during the day if you choose to create the space, because the time that you spent just creating that space is going to be a lot less than the time you need to repair the relationship because you've sent a pretty awful email back, or you've got on the phone and said what you thought in no time at all. So that's an invitation for you to choose to respond rather than react. This image is a prompt for me to say to you, think about the work from Lisa Feldman Barrett, the fact that it's not actually ideal for you to try and get into somebody else's shoes. It's better to ask really great questions and to be present for them without judging, without trying to finish the sentence, without trying to say, yeah, that happened to me. While you can listen and ask questions, that will be even more supportive of someone rather than just jumping in there with your own point of view. I'm just going to finish off with a couple of points here about psychological safety, because I met a chartered psychologist when I was writing an academic paper about emotional intelligence. And it was one of those, I was really pleased I met him for coffee, and then I was really cross because it meant I had to do loads more work. What he was basically saying was, it's all very well, you saying that emotional intelligence, everyone should practice it. What if the organization that you work for doesn't allow you to practice emotional intelligence? Oh my God. So this is another invitation for you to have a look at psychological safety. If you haven't already, you probably have, because it's a bit of a buzz thing going on right now. The fact is, if you have the skill of emotional intelligence, but you don't feel able to go the extra mile, to say this certain thing, to do certain things or behave in a certain way, that's an issue for the organization to solve. Amy Edmondson, the author of this work, she wrote a paper in '99, great book called The Fearless Organization. And she basically says, these types of skills, emotional intelligence, empathy, are more flowing when people feel safe and they're able to be themselves without fear of negative consequence. And she talks about how psychological safety is critical for people to innovate, to be creative, to solve problems. And isn't that the space we're in, ladies and gentlemen? Isn't that what we try and do every single day, is to make things better? It's not just an academic point though. Google did some work some time ago and said, actually, this psychological safety thing is a bit of a secret sauce. We've got amazing teams now who are psychologically safe and they are smashing it. They did some work to find out why teams were brilliant and why teams were not actually capable, and it came back to psychological safety. So the action here, if you'd like to, is to take the test yourself. It's a great book. If you look at that link, you can go and onto that link and you can take a psychological safety test. It will give you the top result of what things are important to you to make you feel safe. And certainly I've used this with clients where we've had a discussion about what it means for them to feel safe and to explore what that particular result means, so that people can consciously behave in a way that enables that person to show themselves up as their whole person. I'm just going to skip through that and say to you, we are all superheroes. We all do phenomenal work and we all make a difference every day. The skill of emotional intelligence is very much an added benefit. It eases the way, it helps us create change more effectively. And even if you tried some of those journal things, or even if you tried the mindful walk, you'd be enhancing what you probably already know. And the fact is that you can get a huge amount of energy from people who also get energy from you when you are present and emotionally intelligent. Diane.
We have attached several resources for you on the next page. There's some links to some of the articles we talked about. And then we want to open it up for questions. I've included our contact information here for any of those things you want to go back and think about, or you have questions or want to talk. That's what we're here for, but let's open it up for questions. Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. Are there anyone in the audience that would like to ask any questions for Sandra and Diane? And there's some questions that were sent through in advance, so I'm going to share some of those. So let's start with the first one. So what's the best way to implement emotional intelligence development into existing systems? So if a company's already, let's say, started that journey, or even just getting started, what would you recommend as the first step?
So if people are already practicing the emotional intelligence skill, what's the next thing that they could do?
Yeah, from a company perspective. So like, what would you recommend as the first step on their journey?
So self-awareness is the first domain that people need to kind of crack. And there are a number of ways that organizations can do that. There are, of course, a number of personality type profiles. There are also emotional intelligence tests that you can take that come out with a result that gives you an idea of how present you are according to the domains that exist in Goleman's model. So I think assessing where you are right now, knowing where your strengths are, and knowing where the work is that needs to be done, because everyone's individual, is a really great place to start, accompanied with the reason why emotional intelligence is so important. Because people will only stay with this and they will persist with it when they realize that they are 3 times more likely to be promoted, they will make more money, they will be more healthy, and things will be more meaningful.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandra. And well, I don't know whether that answers the question that just came through in the chat just before. I think it was an almost paraphrased version of the same question, but does that answer, Natasha? Yeah.
I just want to add something to that, actually, if you don't mind, because I think a new business is a kind of, I feel like it's a fresh canvas. And I would argue that you could, if you chose to, make emotional intelligence or even human connection central in your strategy. Because if you start from that place, and if you start with the ambition of creating meaningful connections, both with your colleagues and with your customers, emotional intelligence is the tool to make that happen. So you can use that as a kind of acid test of, do you know, is this thing going to give us more emotional connection? Yes or no? It can be a big decision-making tool should you wish to go down that route.
Excellent. Thanks, Sandra. And I suppose that there are a lot of amazing examples in there from an academic standpoint, and lots of different ways of doing things or thoughts on what the best way forward is. But are there any examples of companies who have really nailed it that maybe we would be familiar with, international companies or even local companies? Are there any ones that stand out for you?
So this might be a bit of a shocker to those of you who are in the UK, but my experience of the National Health Service is one of the best examples of emotional intelligence. The people who I have met, the people who I have encountered have such incredible connection. They have intuition. They have resilience. They are adaptable. They have organizational awareness. And I think sometimes they go unnoticed. Another one that comes to mind actually is, it is a local coffee shop. So sorry about that. If you live near Reading, then you'll know where it is. It's called The Collective, and I don't know how they do it, but as soon as you walk in their door, they know what you need, because they can tell from your body language and your tone of voice where you're at. I didn't teach them, but they certainly learnt it from somewhere. And it means that I will always go there because I feel like I'm present and I'm heard without saying a word. Let's open that question up. Who else has had experience with brands that are emotionally intelligent?
That one with the NHS, I would say for me, it's a bit of a dichotomy, because I don't feel process-wise anything, almost everything goes wrong. But once you deal with someone one-to-one, I agree with everything you said. So it's a bit of a strange one, really, because if everyone's emotionally intelligent to that level, you would think that things would get solved better from a process perspective. But I suppose it's a different conversation for a different day. But I think once you get and meet people, then I absolutely totally agree with you on that one.
I think that's a really valid point, actually. And so I'd like to slightly change my answer, if it's not too late, to the frontline staff having those skills, and perhaps those that are managing them and those that are in the process design side perhaps don't. I think that's a very, very good point.
Any examples from our friends in the States or the Middle East that are here?
Yeah, hi guys. I'm Mike Kendall in Dallas. Thanks for presentation, Sandra and Diane. I'm kind of thinking internally about how employees treat other employees, and I remember going from a very large global bank where it was kind of your traditional do what I say, don't give me any opinions, very top down, tough environment. Switched over to a Silicon Valley software company that was pretty big, but the first week I was there, I had to present to the senior executive board, and on something I had no idea what I was presenting. It was all this research they'd been doing, but it was now in my bucket, so I had to present it. I remember the day of the presentation, one of the researchers that was working with me said, "How do you feel?" And I was just shocked. Like, I had never heard anybody ask that question at the bank. And it just sort of stopped me. You know, it got me out of that monkey zone, I guess you were talking about. And it was normal, right? It was sort of normative in the culture that you read your colleagues' emotions, you asked about them, you tried to get them in a place of feeling good about themselves and helping out. And it wasn't accidental. I think there were very specific, we call it the leadership success profile, but it applied to everybody. Specific behaviors that were defined based on the level in the company. And that was a part of your performance review of how well do you exhibit those behaviors, not just did you hit your numbers or achieve your goals. And people actually would lose their job or get promoted based on the behavior side as well as on the numbers side. So very intentional, and but very unsettling if you're not used to it. I think it's just a very different culture than a lot of us have lived in some companies.
That is fascinating, because I think that when an organization feels that strongly about it and definitely gets the balance right between the behavior and the task, because let's face it, when you undertake tasks, how you're measured, how your performance is measured, drives particular behaviors. So to be cognizant and to be aware and intentional about it, they sound amazing.
Absolutely. So there's time for maybe one more point or question. Got 4 minutes left. If anyone has any more questions?
I'm curious to know, because I know you mentioned body language is kind of one way to read emotional intelligence. So what is something that you can do if you are working virtually or working from home that can help you kind of like read the room essentially?
It's a great question. And I'd like to answer that in two ways, if I may. The first thing I'd like to say is that many of the things that we're taught aren't true. So, for example, making eye contact is a way to prove that you are engaged. It might be for some, it's definitely not for others. So understanding neurodiversity is really important, because while they might not be looking at you directly in the eye, they are absolutely paying attention if they have any condition that means that they think differently and they problem solve in a different way. So that's one thing. Don't believe all the hype, because it's not actually necessarily true. The second thing is around the non-verbal, and actually, Diane, you're probably better qualified to talk about some of this stuff. So I'm going to give you some insight, but I'm sure Diane's got some really great stuff to add. Generally, nodding or agreeing or participating, responding, not necessarily looking away and certainly not having your camera off is a really good indication. But you can generally see from how people are focused that they're kind of paying attention. I do this trick sometimes with my students where I say that I'm going to ask people a question, so be ready, and they're certainly more present than perhaps keeping their camera off or just like, oh, what's the question? You've just picked on me and I don't know what's going on. So that was a bit of a jumbled response. Diane, something more coherent perhaps.
No, I think you're spot on with the type of connection you can make with people. So the observation of how someone is approaching, how they're talking, the tone of voice, a lot of these things are nonverbal. It doesn't have to necessarily be physical, but all of those things coming into play. I love when you said, how do you read the room? I think it's important to try to think about, what do you want to know? So often in psychology, we start to explore, but we're not quite sure what we're after. So narrow down what you're trying to understand. Are you trying to understand, when you say read the room, who's engaged and who's not? Are you trying to find the person who wants to speak next, who's leaning forward, who's having, so there's a little bit of a next level down, because it is such a broad, that's why you have trouble answering the question. It's so broad when you think about nonverbal. But I think taking it down to that next level of, what do you want to know, and what questions are you having about the audience, begin to help that. And then another way to do it is to also look at a transition of body language. So one of the things that they teach in psychology is things like rephrasing. It's a simple technique, right? To just repeat what somebody said and paraphrase what they have, and watch their language of, did their shoulders go down? Did they get a crinkle in this this age, this 11, we call it up here, did they have a crinkle in their forehead? Did they kind of cock their head? So these small things that can trigger you to begin to advance and really ask the next question are part of how we continually engage. So it's not just that it is reading that room, but it's also really about paying attention to the changes that are happening in nonverbal as well.
Great.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think we have run out of time, unfortunately. I think it's one of those ones we could go on forever. And Sandra, you've been excellent today on twice, 2 webinars today. And Diane, you've come on at what, 6:30 you started? Your time?
Good morning.
Unbelievable. So thank you so much. Excellent presentation. So many things learned there. Certainly for myself, I'm sure the audience feel the same way. So everybody, we're going to share the presentation and also some more information from Market Global's side about Sandra and Diane. And if you want to reach out to Sandra and Diane, that'll be in the presentation at the end. So thank you so much. Excellent presentation. And yeah, hope to see you all soon. Thanks again, Sandra and Diane.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.